June 1st, 2009. The unthinkable happens. General Motors, once the symbol of American power, files for bankruptcy.
Tonight, the collapse of an empire. General Motors is seeking protection in federal court.
In Detroit, the factory lights flicker, conveyor belts stop, and the echo of silence replaces the roar of engine.
Our story begins in 1908, in Flint, Michigan, with a man named William C. Billy Durant. But to understand GM, you first need to understand Billy Durant, because this guy was nothing like the corporate executives you imagine today. Durant wasn't an engineer. He wasn't even particularly interested in cars at first. He was a cigar-smoking, deal-making, risk-taking entrepreneur who had made his fortune building horse-drawn carriages. His Durant Dort Carriage Company was one of the largest in America, churning out over 150,000 carriages a year. But in the early 1900s, Durant saw something that would change his life forever: the automobile. At the time, the car industry was chaos. Hundreds of tiny companies were building cars in garages and small factories across America. Most would fail within a year. There was no standardization, no mass production, no clear winner. It was the Wild West of manufacturing. Durant looked at this mess and saw opportunity. But his vision wasn't to build the best car, it was to build an empire of car companies. Durant took control of a struggling company called Buick Motor Company in 1904 and turned it into one of the most successful car makers in America. By 1908, Buick was selling more cars than anyone except Ford. But Durant wanted more. On September 16, 1908, he incorporated the General Motors Company in New Jersey with $2,000 in capital, about $65,000 today, pocket change even then. His plan was audacious: buy up every successful car company he could find and create an automotive conglomerate that would dominate the industry. And that's exactly what he did. The shopping spree begins. Within the first 2 years, Durant went on an acquisition frenzy that would make modern private equity firms blush. Buick, already owned, became the foundation. Oldsmobile, bought in 1908 for $3 million. Oakland, later became Pontiac, acquired 1909. Cadillac, purchased 1909 for $4.5 million. The crown jewel, Cadillac was already known for luxury and precision. Several others, including some that would quickly fail. Durant tried to buy Ford Motor Company for $8 million in 1909. Henry Ford agreed to sell. But Durant couldn't get the cash together in time. He needed it all in cash, not stock, and the deal fell through. Imagine how different history would be if GM had owned Ford. The strategy. Durant's genius was this: instead of putting all his eggs in one basket, he created a portfolio of brands targeting different price points. Cadillac, for the wealthy elite. Buick, for the upper middle class. Oldsmobile, for the middle class. Oakland/Pontiac, for the working class trying to move up. This brand ladder strategy would define GM for the next century. You'd start with a Chevrolet as a young worker, move up to a Pontiac when you got promoted, buy a Buick when you made it to middle management, and finally arrive with a Cadillac when you became an executive. It was the American dream on 4 wheels. But here's the thing about Billy Durant: he was terrible with money. By 1910, just 2 years after founding GM, Durant had bought so many companies, some good, many terrible, and spent so much money that GM was drowning in debt. The bank stepped in, forced Durant out of his own company, and took control. Durant was furious. But he wasn't done. In 1911, Durant partnered with race car driver Louis Chevrolet to create the Chevrolet Motor Company. His plan: build Chevrolet into a success, then use it to buy back control of General Motors. It was one of the most audacious corporate takeovers in history. Durant positioned Chevrolet as a direct competitor to Ford's Model T, affordable, reliable, and available to the masses. While Ford famously said you could have the Model T in any color as long as it's black, Durant offered choice and style. By 1915, Chevrolet was profitable and growing fast. Durant started secretly buying GM stock. He recruited investors, made deals, and quietly accumulated shares. In 1916, in a stunning reversal, Durant had bought enough Chevrolet stock and GM stock to stage a takeover. He walked into a GM board meeting and announced, "Gentlemen, I control General Motors again." The bankers were stunned. Billy Durant was back in charge, and he immediately merged Chevrolet into GM, giving the company its mass-market brand to compete with Ford. With Durant back in control, GM entered its golden age. But ironically, it wasn't Durant who would build GM into the world's largest corporation. He would be forced out again in 1920 after another financial crisis. The guy just couldn't stop spending. The man who really built General Motors into an empire was Alfred P. Sloan, Jr. If Billy Durant was the wild dreamer who created GM, Alfred Sloan was the disciplined genius who perfected it. Sloan became president of GM in 1923 and would lead the company for the next 3 decades. He was the anti-Durant, methodical, analytical, obsessed with organization and efficiency. Sloan's revolutionary ideas. Divisional structure. Each brand, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, operated as a separate division with its own management, but shared parts and resources. This became the template for modern corporate organization worldwide. The annual model change. Sloan invented the concept of planned obsolescence. Every year, GM would release new models with styling changes, making last year's car seem outdated. This kept customers coming back. Consumer financing. GM created GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation, to offer car loans, making it easier for average Americans to buy cars. Before this, most people had to pay cash.
The car for every person purpose. Sloan perfected Durant's brand ladder strategy, ensuring GM had a vehicle for every income level and life stage. Market research. GM was one of the first companies to extensively study consumer preferences and design cars accordingly. The results were staggering. By 1931, GM had surpassed Ford as America's #1 automaker. By the 1950s, GM controlled over 50% of the U.S. car market. At its peak in 1955, GM became the first American corporation to earn over $1 billion in a single year. GM didn't just make cars, they shaped American culture. Tail fins and chrome in the 1950s. Muscle cars like the Pontiac GTO and Chevrolet Camaro in the 1960s. Personal luxury coupes like the Cadillac Eldorado. The suburban dream enabled by affordable Chevrolet sedans. GM employed over 600,000 people at its peak. Entire cities, Flint, Michigan, Lansing, Detroit suburbs, were built around GM factories. Multi-generational families worked for GM. The company offered incredible benefits: pensions, healthcare, job security. Being a GM man meant you were set for life. Everything changed on October 17, 1973. Arab members of OPEC proclaimed an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War, including the United States. Oil prices quadrupled. Gas stations ran dry. Americans waited in lines for hours just to fill their tanks. And suddenly GM's massive, gas-guzzling boats, the Cadillac Eldorado, Buick Electra, Chevrolet Impala, seemed ridiculous. Meanwhile, small, fuel-efficient Japanese cars from Toyota, Honda, and Datsun, now Nissan, started flooding the American market. They were reliable, affordable, and got twice the gas mileage of American cars. GM's response? They panicked and made some of the worst cars in American history. Chevrolet Vega, 1971 to 1977, rushed to market to compete with imports. The engine would literally self-destruct. Rust would appear within months. It became a symbol of American automotive decline. Cadillac Cimarron, 1982 to 1988. GM tried to make a luxury Cadillac by slapping a Cadillac badge on a Chevrolet Cavalier and charging twice the price. It fooled nobody and destroyed Cadillac's reputation. Oldsmobile diesel fiasco, 1978 to 1985. GM converted gasoline engines to diesel by basically adding diesel fuel injectors. They exploded. Engines seized. It killed the Oldsmobile brand's credibility. The problem wasn't just bad cars, it was GM's culture. The company had become bureaucratic, arrogant, and complacent. They believed Americans would always buy American cars out of patriotism. They were wrong. By the 1980s, Japanese automakers weren't just competing, they were winning. Why Japanese cars were better? Quality control. Toyota pioneered Kaizen, continuous improvement, and just-in-time manufacturing. Their defect rates were a fraction of GM's. Reliability. Japanese cars would run for 200,000 plus miles with basic maintenance. GM cars often had problems before 50,000 miles. Fuel efficiency. Even after the oil crises ended, Americans had learned to value efficiency. Design. While GM was making boxy, boring cars, Japanese companies were making attractive, well-designed vehicles. GM's response: denial and protectionism. Instead of fixing their problems, GM, along with Ford and Chrysler, lobbied the government for protection. In 1981, they convinced Reagan's administration to pressure Japan into voluntary export restraints. It helped temporarily, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem. GM was making inferior products. The Roger Smith era. How to waste $80 billion, 1981 to 1990. In 1981, Roger Smith became CEO of GM. He had a vision to revolutionize GM through technology and reorganization. What followed was one of the most expensive corporate disasters in history. Smith's brilliant ideas. Buying EDS. 1984, GM paid $2.5 billion to acquire Ross Perot's data processing company. The idea was to modernize GM's computer systems. Instead, it created culture clash warfare. Perot loudly criticized GM management and was eventually bought out for $700 million just to shut him up. Buying Hughes Aircraft. 1985, GM spent $5 billion to acquire a defense contractor. What? Nobody really knew. It had nothing to do with making cars. They eventually sold it at a loss. The Saturn experiment. 1985, GM created Saturn as a completely separate company to compete with Japanese imports. They spent $5 billion building a new factory in Tennessee. Saturn made decent cars and had innovative no-haggle pricing, but never made a profit and was eventually killed in 2010. Robotics obsession. Smith spent billions automating factories with robots. Many didn't work properly. Some robots painted each other instead of cars. The human workers GM laid off to make room for robots? They knew how to make cars. The robots didn't. Reorganization chaos. Smith restructured GM's divisions, creating confusion and destroying institutional knowledge. The reorganization was so badly executed that it became a Harvard Business School case study on how not to run a company. The results? Roger Smith spent over $80 billion in 1980s dollars trying to modernize GM. Quality got worse. Market share continued to fall. The company became even more bureaucratic. A documentary filmmaker named Michael Moore made a film called Roger and Me, 1989, about Smith's decision to close factories in Flint, Michigan, devastating the city. It became a cultural phenomenon and made Smith the face of corporate callousness. By 1990, when Smith retired, GM's U.S. market share had fallen from 46% to 35%. The Japanese were eating their lunch. The 1990s brought GM a reprieve, but it would ultimately make their problems worse. Americans fell in love with SUVs and pickup trucks. The Ford Explorer, Chevrolet Tahoe, and GMC Yukon became status symbols. Gas was cheap, dropping below $1 per gallon at times, and bigger was better. For GM, this was a gold mine. SUVs and trucks cost about the same to build as sedans but sold for $10,000 to $15,000 more. The profit margins were insane, sometimes $10,000 plus per vehicle. GM, Ford, and Chrysler abandoned the small car market to the Japanese and focused on trucks and SUVs. Why make $1,000 on a small car when you could make $10,000 on a Suburban? The problem? This strategy was completely dependent on cheap gas. GM was addicted to high-margin trucks and SUVs. They weren't investing in fuel-efficient technology or hybrid systems like Toyota was developing.
They were building their entire business model on a house of cards. While GM was riding the SUV wave in the 1990s, a massive problem was growing beneath the surface: legacy costs. Remember all those generous benefits GM offered workers during the good times? The guaranteed pensions, free health care for life, cost of living adjustments? By 2000, GM had 450,000 retirees and surviving spouses receiving pensions and health care. Only 140,000 active workers actually building cars. Do the math. GM was supporting more than 3 retirees for every active worker. The numbers were insane. GM was spending $5.2 billion per year on healthcare alone. That added about $1,500 to the cost of every vehicle GM built. Toyota's healthcare costs per vehicle? About $200. GM was spending more on healthcare than on steel. They joked that GM had become a healthcare company that happened to make cars on the side. Why didn't they fix this? The United Auto Workers, UAW, union was powerful. Any attempt to cut retiree benefits would trigger massive strikes. GM's management took the easy way out. Promise future management would deal with it. Classic executive short-term thinking: I'll retire before this becomes catastrophic. In June 2000, Rick Wagoner became CEO of General Motors. He was a GM lifer who had risen through the finance department. Smart, well-liked internally, and a true believer that GM could turn things around. He inherited a company with declining market share, now under 30%. Crushing legacy costs. Too many brands, 8 brands in North America alone. Too many dealers, over 6,000, compared to Toyota's 1,200. Dependence on SUV and truck profits. Inferior product quality compared to Japanese competitors. Wagoner's strategy. He actually tried to fix things. Quality improvements. Invested billions in improving manufacturing and design. New products. Pushed for better vehicles like the Cadillac CTS and Chevrolet Malibu. Cost-cutting. Negotiated with the UAW to reduce healthcare costs, slightly. International expansion. Pushed hard into China and other emerging markets. Some of this worked. By the mid-2000s, GM vehicles were actually getting pretty good. The Cadillac CTS won awards. The Chevrolet Malibu could compete with the Toyota Camry. But it was too little, too late. In 2005, oil prices started climbing. By 2007, gas was hitting $3 per gallon. By summer 2008, it would reach $4 per gallon, unthinkable to Americans used to cheap gas. The impact was immediate. SUV and truck sales collapsed. Nobody wanted a Hummer H2 that got 10 miles per gallon. Chevrolet Tahoes sat on dealer lots, unsold. GM's most profitable products, the cash cows that funded everything, became unsellable. Meanwhile, Toyota's Prius became the hottest car in America. Hybrid technology that GM had ignored for years was suddenly the future. GM's product lineup was all wrong. They had too many large SUVs and trucks, now unwanted. Too many mediocre sedans, losing to Japanese quality. Weak small car offerings, losing money on each one sold. 8 brands, many with overlapping products that confused consumers. Pontiac, Buick, Saturn, Saab, Hummer, all were losing money or barely profitable. But GM couldn't kill them because of dealer franchise laws and political pressure. The credit crisis arrives, 2008. Then came September 2008, and everything went to hell. Lehman Brothers collapsed. The financial system froze. Credit markets disappeared. The global economy entered free fall. For GM, this was catastrophic. Nobody could get car loans. Even people who wanted to buy cars couldn't get financing. Auto sales industry-wide dropped 40%. GM's finance arm, GMAC, collapsed. GMAC, which provided car loans, was hemorrhaging money and needed its own bailout. Suppliers were failing. Parts suppliers couldn't get credit and were going bankrupt. Without parts, GM couldn't build cars. Dealer financing dried up. Dealers couldn't get loans to stock inventory. No inventory equals no sales. The bleeding was horrific. Q3 2008, GM lost $2.5 billion. Q4 2008, GM lost $9.6 billion. Yes, in just 3 months. Monthly cash burn, $1 to $2 billion per month. At this rate, GM would run out of cash by January or February 2009. Then they would have to stop building cars, stop paying workers, and shut down. Complete liquidation. The end of General Motors. By November 2008, GM, Ford, and Chrysler were in desperate straits. They needed emergency loans from Congress or they would collapse within weeks. The CEOs, Rick Wagoner, GM, Alan Mulally, Ford, and Robert Nardelli, Chrysler, were summoned to Washington to testify before Congress and request $25 billion in emergency loans. Then came the PR disaster that would define the crisis. All 3 CEOs flew to Washington in separate corporate jets. Congressman Brad Sherman of California asked the question that would doom them. I'm going to ask the 3 executives here to raise their hand if they flew here commercial. No hands went up. Second, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you're planning to sell your jet in place now and fly back commercial. Again, no hands. Let the record show, no hands went up. The room erupted. Congress members from both parties attacked them. Representative Gary Ackerman, Democrat, New York, there's a delicious irony in seeing private luxury jets flying into Washington, D.C., and people coming off of them with tin cups in their hands, saying that they're going to be trimming down and streamlining their businesses. It's almost like seeing a guy show up at the soup kitchen in high hat and tuxedo. Representative Peter Roskam, Republican, Illinois, couldn't you all have downgraded to first class or jet pooled or something to get here? It would have at least sent a message that you do get it. The public relations catastrophe. The private jet story dominated the news. It became a symbol of everything wrong with Detroit: out-of-touch executives, wasteful spending, arrogance. Never mind that. The jets were already owned. Not selling them wouldn't save money. Security and schedule concerns made commercial travel difficult. Ford's Mulally had actually tried to fly commercial but was overruled by his board. None of that mattered. The image was set: greedy CEOs begging for taxpayer money while flying private jets. Congress refused the bailout. The bailout request failed. Congress sent them home empty-handed, telling them to come back with actual restructuring plans. GM stock plummeted to $3 per share. It had been over $40 just a few years earlier. The CEOs returned to Washington in December. This time, Wagoner drove a Chevrolet Hybrid from Detroit to Washington, 520 miles. They presented detailed restructuring plans. They explained the domino effect of a GM bankruptcy. The doomsday scenario. If GM collapsed, 239,000 GM employees would lose their jobs immediately. 500,000 plus supplier jobs would disappear. Suppliers depended on GM orders. 1+ million total jobs affected when counting dealers, part shops, etc. Entire cities like Detroit, Flint, and others would become ghost towns. Pensions for 450,000 retirees would disappear. The middle class would be devastated in the Midwest. Studies suggested that GM's bankruptcy would cost the economy $100+ billion and push unemployment past 10%. But Congress still said no. Republicans argued this was a free market failure and GM should be allowed to fail. Democrats were more sympathetic but couldn't get enough votes. The automakers appeared doomed. President George W. Bush, in the final weeks of his presidency, faced an impossible choice. Let GM and Chrysler fail and trigger economic Armageddon, or use executive authority to save them using TARP funds, the Troubled Asset Relief Program created to save banks. Bush chose to act. On December 19, 2008, Bush announced $13.4 billion in emergency loans to GM, $4 billion to Chrysler. Conditions: companies must present viable restructuring plans by March 31, 2009. Bush explained his decision. I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system. These are not ordinary circumstances. In the midst of a financial crisis and a recession, allowing the U.S. auto industry to collapse is not a responsible course of action. This bought GM a few months. But everyone knew this was just delaying the inevitable unless GM could dramatically restructure. Barack Obama took office January 20, 2009, inheriting this mess. He appointed an automotive task force led by Stephen Ratner, investment banker, Wall Street veteran; Ron Bloom, former union official turned restructuring expert; other advisors, Treasury officials, industry consultants. Their job: figure out if GM and Chrysler could be saved, and if so, how. The task force's brutal assessment. After reviewing GM's restructuring plan, the task force's conclusion was devastating. General Motors' plan is not viable as submitted. The company has made considerable progress but needs to accelerate restructuring. Translation: GM's plan wasn't nearly aggressive enough. They needed to cut more brands, close more factories, fire more workers, reduce dealer count by 40%, slash debt by tens of billions, renegotiate union contracts. And most dramatically, Rick Wagoner had to go. On March 29, 2009, Rick Wagoner received a phone call from Stephen Ratner, head of the Auto Task Force. The message was simple: resign as CEO, or the government will withhold further funding and GM will collapse immediately. Wagoner was shocked. He had led GM for 9 years, had been with the company for 32 years. He believed he was the right person to lead GM through this crisis. But the Obama administration disagreed. They wanted a clean break, new leadership, new thinking, new GM. March 30, 2009. Wagoner resigned. Fritz Henderson, GM's president and COO, was named the new CEO. But everyone knew Henderson was temporary. The real decisions would come from the task force. Obama's announcement. President Obama addressed the nation. The path they have laid out is not viable. GM has made a good faith effort but needs to do more. The United States government has no interest in running GM. We have no intention of running GM. Narrator voice. They would, in fact, end up running GM. Obama gave GM 60 more days to present an acceptable restructuring plan. The deadline, June 1, 2009. Or else, bankruptcy. The next 60 days were a frantic race against time. What GM had to do? Kill brands. Pontiac announced it would be eliminated, ending an 84-year history. Saturn would be sold or killed. Hummer would be sold. Saab would be sold. Close factories. 14 manufacturing plants would shut down. Cut dealers. From 6,000 dealers down to 3,600, 40% reduction. Fire workers. 21,000 more jobs eliminated. Slash debt. $27 billion in unsecured debt had to be restructured. Negotiate with UAW. The union had to accept. Wage cuts. Reduced health care benefits. Stock instead of cash for retiree health care fund. The dealer terminations. The dealer cuts were brutal. These were small business owners. Many who had run GM dealerships for 50-plus years, family businesses passed down through generations. They received certified letters. Your franchise agreement is terminated. You have 30 days. Imagine running a business for decades, employing dozens of people, only to receive a letter saying, you're done. No compensation, no buyout, just gone. Lawsuits would follow, congressional hearings, outrage. But the task force was ruthless. Cut or die. GM had $27 billion in unsecured bonds. Debt held by investors, pension funds, retirees who thought GM bonds were safe. The government's offer. Trade your bonds for 10% of the new GM stock. Translation. You're getting 10 cents on the dollar. The bondholders revolted. This is highway robbery. The government is giving the UAW union 17.5% ownership, but we get only 10%? We're owed more money. They had a point. Normally in bankruptcy, bondholders get paid before unions. But this wasn't a normal bankruptcy, this was a political bankruptcy. The Obama administration needed UAW support. The union had helped elect Obama. And keeping union pensions intact was politically essential. Some called it the cram-down, using government power to force a deal that favored labor over creditors. The bondholders had no choice. If they refused and GM liquidated, they would get zero. Their bonds would be worthless. At least 10% of a new company was something. Most accepted. Those who didn't, too bad. Bankruptcy would wipe them out anyway. By late May, it was clear, GM couldn't avoid bankruptcy. The debt was too large. The restructuring too complex. Time had run out. GM would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the fourth largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. The plan. Use bankruptcy to kill bad contracts, dealer agreements, union provisions. Shed debt, $95 billion in liabilities eliminated. Break the company in two. New GM. Keep the good assets, strong brands, profitable plants. Old GM. Motors Liquidation Company. All the bad stuff goes here to die. The U.S. Treasury would provide $30 billion more, on top of the $20 billion already lent, to fund the bankruptcy. Total government investment. $50 billion. In return, the U.S. government would own 60% of the new General Motors. Government Motors was born. At 8 a.m. Eastern Time, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in U.S. Bankruptcy Court in Manhattan. The filing listed $82.29 billion in assets, $172.81 billion in liabilities, $90+ billion gap. It was the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history, the fourth largest bankruptcy overall, after Lehman Brothers, Washington Mutual, and WorldCom. The courtroom scene. The bankruptcy hearing was surreal. A company that once built one of every 2 cars in America was now asking a judge for permission to stay in business. Judge Robert Gerber presided. The proceedings would move with unprecedented speed. Most bankruptcies take years. This one had to be done in 40 days. Why the rush? Every day in bankruptcy cost millions. Suppliers wouldn't ship parts. Customers wouldn't buy cars from a bankrupt company. The brand was being destroyed. President Obama's address. That afternoon, Obama spoke from the White House. What we're buying is a chance for GM to compete. What we're not doing is spending money on a company or an industry that's not willing to change. He continued. The GM that emerges from this restructuring will be different. It will be a stronger, more competitive company. A 21st century company that will help ensure America's place as the economic leader of the world. Critics were less optimistic. They called it the biggest corporate welfare in history. Socialism. Rewarding failure. Over the next 40 days, GM was essentially dismembered and rebuilt. What was killed? Pontiac, EST 1926, the brand that gave us the GTO, Firebird, and Trans Am, was dead. Final production, January 2010. Saturn, EST 1985, GM's $5 billion experiment to compete with Japanese brands. Failed, dead. Hummer, EST 1992, the military vehicle turned civilian monstrosity, symbol of excess, dead. A Chinese company tried to buy it, but the deal fell through. Saab acquired 1989 the quirky Swedish brand. Sold, later went bankrupt anyway in 2011. 2,600 dealerships. Terminated. Small business owners destroyed. 14 manufacturing plants. Closed. Towns devastated. 21,000 jobs. Eliminated immediately. Thousands more indirectly. What survived? Chevrolet, the volume brand, kept. Cadillac, the luxury brand, kept. Buick, popular in China, kept. GMC, profitable trucks, kept. 4 brands instead of 8. Simpler. Focused. The money. The capital structure of new GM. U.S. Treasury, 60.8% ownership, $49.5 billion invested. Canadian/Ontario governments, 11.7%, $9.5 billion invested. UAW Retiree Health Fund, VIBA 17.5%. Old GM bondholders, 10%. That's right, the U.S. government owns 61% of General Motors. The government Motors jokes wrote themselves. Behind the statistics were real people. The dealership owner in Iowa. John Patterson's family had run a GM dealership in small-town Iowa since 1946. 3 generations. They employed 35 people. His grandfather bought his first car from this dealership. Letter arrived May 15, 2009. Franchise terminated. August 1, 2009. No buyout. No compensation. Just, you're done. Patterson later testified before Congress. We've been loyal to General Motors for 63 years. We survived the Depression, World War II, every recession. And this is how they thank us. The factory worker in Flint. Mary Johnson, age 51, had worked at the Flint truck assembly plant for 28 years. Her father worked there for 40 years before retiring. Her son just got hired a year ago. The plant closed. Mary was 3 years short of full pension. She lost her health care. Her son, with 1 year of seniority, got nothing. Flint, already devastated by decades of plant closures, memorably documented in Roger and Me 20 years earlier, was gutted again. The retiree in Arizona. Bob Williams retired from GM in 1995 after 35 years on the assembly line. He was promised health care for life. He'd paid into it. He'd earned it. In bankruptcy, retiree health care was slashed. His prescription drug costs went from $20 per month to $200 per month. Doctor co-pays tripled. At age 73, living on a fixed pension, he had to choose between medications and groceries. He felt betrayed. I gave them my life, my back, my knees. And they threw me away like garbage. The bondholder in Florida. Margaret Chen, a 68-year-old widow, had invested her late husband's life insurance money, $100,000, in GM bonds in 2006. They were rated investment grade by the ratings agencies. Reliable. Her bonds, worth $100,000, were exchanged for stock worth about $10,000. She lost 90% of her nest egg overnight. She wrote to her congressman, "I wasn't a greedy Wall Street banker. I was a teacher trying to save for retirement. How is this fair?" These were the real costs of GM's failure. Not just numbers on a spreadsheet. Families, dreams, livelihoods, communities. After just 40 days, a lightning-fast bankruptcy, new GM emerged from Chapter 11 protection. Judge Gerber approved the sale of GM's good assets to a new company. The old GM, renamed Motors Liquidation Company, would slowly liquidate what remained. The new GM. Cleaner balance sheet, most debt eliminated. Lower costs, $23 billion in annual cost savings. Fewer brands, 4 instead of 8. Fewer dealers, 3,600 instead of 6,000. Fewer factories, 34 instead of 47. Fewer employees, 68,500 U.S. hourly workers, down from 395,000 at peak in 1970s. Fritz Henderson, the CEO, said, "This is a new era for General Motors and for everyone who works here. The old GM is gone." But the stigma remained. Customers stayed away. Government motors became a punchline. Conservative talk radio hammered it daily. Obama's socialist car company. Our tax dollars wasted. They should have let them fail. Sales remained weak. The economy was still in recession. Nobody was buying cars. In December 2009, Fritz Henderson was forced out. He'd only been CEO for 8 months. The board, led by the U.S. government, wanted fresh leadership. Someone from outside the auto industry. Someone who could shake things up. Enter Ed Whittaker, former CEO of AT&T. He was 68 years old, a no-nonsense Texan who knew nothing about cars. And that was exactly the point. Whittaker's first days. On his first day at GM headquarters in Detroit, Whittaker gathered executives and asked basic questions. How long does it take to make a decision around here? Why do we need 17 people to approve a new radio for the Malibu? Why does every brand have its own marketing team? Can't they share? The GM executives gave long, complicated answers about process and legacy systems and coordination. Whittaker cut them off. That's BS. Fix it. Next. His strategy. Speed. Cut bureaucracy. Make decisions faster. Accountability. Every executive had clear metrics. Hit them or get fired. Marketing. GM made good cars now. They needed to tell people. Quality. Continue quality improvements. Match Toyota. The famous "May the best car win" ad campaign. In 2010, GM launched an aggressive advertising campaign challenging people to compare their cars to competitors. The ads featured real GM employees, not actors, saying, "We're not asking for your business because we need it. We're asking because we've earned it. May the best car win." It was risky, cocky even, but it worked. It reframed the narrative. GM wasn't a charity case, they were competitors again. By late 2010, GM was ready to go public again. November 18, 2010, General Motors' initial public offering, IPO, launched at $33 per share. It was the largest IPO in U.S. history at the time, raising $23.1 billion. The results. The U.S. Treasury sold about 30% of its stake. Still owned 33% of GM, down from 61%. Recovered about $13.5 billion of the $49.5 billion invested. Stock symbol, GM, same as before bankruptcy. Wall Street was cautiously optimistic. GM was profitable again. Sales were improving. The Chevrolet Cruze and Volt were getting good reviews. But there was a problem. At $33 per share, the government needed GM stock to reach about $53 per share to break even on the bailout. It would never get there. Ed Whittaker retired in September 2010 after just 9 months. His job was done. Stabilize the ship. Dan Ackerson, a former Navy officer and private equity executive, took over as CEO. Ackerson was a hard-charging, demanding leader. Some called him abrasive. But he kept pushing GM forward. Key achievements. Profitability restored. GM posted annual profits of $6 to $9 billion from 2011 to 2014. China becomes #1 market. GM sold more cars in China than in the U.S. The Chinese loved Buicks, status symbol there. This became GM's profit engine. Chevrolet Volt, GM's plug-in hybrid, showed they were serious about electric vehicles. It won awards but sold modestly, too expensive at $40,000 plus. Cadillac revival. The CTS and ATS competed with BMW and Mercedes. Cadillac was cool again, sort of. Chevrolet quality. The Malibu, Cruze, and Impala could finally compete with Camry and Accord. But problems remained. The ignition switch scandal. 2014 GM admitted it knew about a defective ignition switch for years that caused at least 124 deaths. They delayed recalls to save money. The scandal cost GM $4.1 billion in fines and settlements and destroyed trust. Europe money pit. GM's European operations, Opel/Vauxhall, lost money every year, billions total. Market share still declining, now down to about 18% in the U.S., from 50% at peak. On December 9, 2013, the U.S. Treasury announced it was selling its final shares of GM stock. The government was out of the car business. The final tally. Invested, $49.5 billion. Recovered, $39.7 billion. Loss, $10.5 billion. Republicans. C. We lost $10 billion. Government shouldn't pick winners and losers. Democrats. We saved an entire industry and millions of jobs for $10 billion. That's a bargain. The real math. Economists argued about the true cost. Tax revenue from saved jobs, unknown but substantial. Unemployment benefits not paid, billions. Social costs of Detroit collapse, incalculable. Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, PBGC, bailout avoided, $100+ billion. Center for Automotive Research estimated the bailout saved 1.2 million jobs in 2009 alone. Was $10.5 billion a reasonable price? Depends who you ask. In January 2014, Mary Barra became CEO of General Motors, the first woman to lead a major global automaker. Barra was a GM lifer, started at 18 as a co-op student, who worked her way up through engineering and manufacturing. She understood how to build cars. Her leadership was immediately tested. Week 1 of her tenure, the ignition switch scandal exploded. Barra had to testify before Congress, apologize, fire 15 executives, and overhaul GM's safety culture. She handled it with transparency and accountability, a stark change from old GM's deny and defend approach. Barra's vision: transform GM. Barra recognized that the auto industry was facing massive disruption. Electric vehicles, Tesla was proving it could work. Autonomous driving, Google was testing self-driving cars. Ride-sharing, Uber/Lyft were changing transportation. China, becoming the world's largest auto market. Old GM would build the same cars for decades. New GM had to become a technology company. 1. Buying Cruze. 2016 GM acquired Cruze Automation, a self-driving car startup, for $1 billion. Invested billions more. Cruise became one of the leaders in autonomous vehicle development. 2. Maven. GM launched a car-sharing service to compete with Zipcar and compete in the mobility space. 3. Selling Opel/Vauxhall, 2017 finally exited the money-losing European market, selling to PSA Group, Peugeot, for $2.3 billion. This alone improved profitability. 4. All-electric future. 2017 Barra announced GM would go all-electric, launching 20-plus EV models by 2023. Wall Street was skeptical. Tesla had a massive head start, but Barra was committed. 5. Killing more brands. Discontinued Chevrolet Volt, 2019. Not selling enough. Closed several U.S. plants. Cut 14,000 jobs. Exited South Africa, India, and other unprofitable markets. Trump attacks GM. When GM announced plant closures in Ohio and Michigan in 2018, President Trump exploded on Twitter. Very disappointed with General Motors and their CEO, Mary Barra, for closing plants in Ohio, Michigan, and Maryland. The U.S. saved General Motors, and this is the thanks we get. Barra didn't back down. The closures were necessary for profitability. At an event in March 2020, GM unveiled its Ultium battery platform, a modular electric vehicle system that would underpin dozens of EVs. The strategy: invest $35+ billion in EVs and AVs, autonomous vehicles, by 2025. Launch EVs across all brands and price points. Build U.S. battery factories, with LG Energy Solution. Target 2035 to phase out all gas-powered vehicles globally. Beat Tesla. The vehicles. GMC Hummer EV, 2022 electric supertruck with 1,000 horsepower, $110,000. Sold out immediately. Cadillac Lyriq, 2023 luxury electric SUV competing with Tesla Model X. Chevrolet Silverado EV, 2024 electric pickup to compete with Ford F-150 Lightning. Chevrolet Equinox EV, 2024 affordable $30,000 EV for the masses. Cadillac Escalade IQ, 2025 electric luxury SUV. The results so far: mixed. GM is selling EVs, but still far behind Tesla in volume. Losing money on most EVs, batteries still expensive. Dealers often don't know how to sell EVs. Charging infrastructure still inadequate in much of U.S. But GM is committed. No turning back. COVID-19 hit the auto industry hard in 2020. Factories shut down for months. Sales collapsed initially. Supply chains disrupted. But then something weird happened. When the economy reopened, there was huge pent-up demand for vehicles. People wanted cars, safer than public transit during COVID. But there was a semiconductor chip shortage. Factories couldn't get the computer chips needed for modern cars. Result: low inventory, high prices. Dealers marking up vehicles $5,000 to $10,000 over sticker. GM actually made more profit on fewer vehicles. GM's profit in 2021, $10 billion, one of the best years ever. But it exposed a vulnerability: dependence on foreign chip suppliers. Current status: revenue, $170 billion annually. Market cap, $50 billion, compared to Tesla's $800+ billion. Employees, 160,000 globally. U.S. market share, 16%, still declining slowly. China, still huge market, but facing pressure from local EV makers like BYD. EVs, ramping up, but not yet profitable overall. Cruise, autonomous hit major setbacks after safety incidents in 2023, scaled back operations significantly. The challenges ahead: Tesla dominance. Tesla still owns 50% plus of U.S. EV market. Chinese competition, BYD and others making cheap, good EVs. Profitability: need to make money on EVs, not just sell them. Charging infrastructure, still not good enough for mass adoption. Dealer resistance: many dealers don't want to invest in EV infrastructure. Political wins: if EV mandates get rolled back, does strategy change? 1. Original shareholders, pre-bankruptcy. Anyone who owned GM stock before June 1, 2009 lost everything. The stock went to zero. Wiped out. Retail investors who thought GM was too big to fail. Pension funds that owned GM stock. Retirees with GM in their 401(k)s. Total losses, $80+ billion in shareholder value destroyed. 2. Bondholders. GM bondholders got 10 cents on the dollar. Many were individual retirees who bought safe GM bonds. Insurance companies. Pension funds. They lost $17+ billion collectively. 3. Dealerships. Terminated franchises. 2,600 dealerships were terminated. These were multi-generational family businesses. Small-town employers. Investment of decades. Many received no compensation. Later lawsuits recovered some money, but most dealers were devastated. Average loss per dealer, $1 to $3 million in invested capital plus future earnings. 4. Workers laid off. 21,000 direct GM job cuts in 2009. Tens of thousands more from supplier bankruptcies. Wage cuts for remaining workers. Reduced benefits and pensions. Cities like Flint, Pontiac, and parts of Detroit were gutted. 5. Salaried retirees. GM's salaried retirees lost. Healthcare benefits cut significantly. Some lost up to 40% of healthcare value. Prescription drug costs soared. 6. Taxpayers, sort of. Lost $10.5 billion on the GM bailout, lost $12+ billion on Chrysler bailout, plus billions more on supplier bailouts. GMAC/Ally Financial. Total auto bailout loss, $25 billion. Though economists argue the broader economic benefits exceeded this. 7. Saturn fans. Saturn had a cult following, loyal customers who loved the brand's customer service and no-haggle pricing. When Saturn died, these customers felt betrayed. Many never bought another GM vehicle. 8. Pontiac enthusiasts. Pontiac built American icons, GTO, Firebird, Trans Am, Grand Prix. Killing Pontiac killed an 84-year legacy and broke the hearts of muscle car fans. 9. Rick Wagoner. The CEO who was forced out. Lost his job. Became the face of failure. Legacy destroyed. Though he walked away with a pension worth millions, he'll always be remembered as the man who killed GM. 1. The UAW, United Auto Workers Union. Shockingly, the union did relatively well. Got 17.5% ownership of new GM. Retiree Healthcare Trust, VEBA, received billions in funding. Most worker pensions protected. New union contracts were cuts but not devastating. Why? Political power. The Obama administration needed union support. Unions helped elect Obama. So in the bankruptcy negotiation, the UAW got a better deal than their legal seniority warranted. Many bondholders felt the union got preferential treatment. 2. Surviving GM employees. 68,500 hourly workers kept their jobs. That's 68,500 families that didn't face unemployment during the worst recession since the Great Depression. Their wages and benefits were cut, but they had jobs. 3. The broader economy/society. Economists at the Center for Automotive Research estimated the bailout saved 1.2 million jobs in 2009, prevented unemployment from reaching 12% plus, saved $105 billion in social costs, kept entire supply chain alive. For $10.5 billion, that's arguably a massive win. 4. New GM leadership. Ed Whitaker, Dan Ackerson, and Mary Barra got to lead a clean sheet company. No legacy costs. No crushing debt. Opportunity to rebuild. They got the fun part without the decades of baggage. 5. Ford Motor Company. Ford was the big winner in public perception. Ford CEO Alan Mulally famously said Ford didn't need a bailout. Though Ford did get government-backed loans separately, but not TARP funds. The marketing impact. Ford didn't take your tax dollars became a powerful message. Ford's sales and brand perception soared relative to GM and Chrysler. Many Americans specifically chose Ford because they stood on their own. 6. Foreign automakers, Toyota, Honda, Hyundai. While GM was in chaos from 2008 to 2011, Toyota, Honda, and Hyundai grabbed massive market share. They also avoided the government motors stigma. 7. Tesla. GM's bankruptcy and slow EV adoption gave Tesla years to establish itself. If GM had aggressively pursued EVs in 2008 to 2010 instead of fighting for survival, Tesla might never have become dominant. 8. Lawyers and consultants. The bankruptcy generated $600 plus million in legal and consulting fees. Lawyers from multiple firms billed $1,000 plus per hour for months. 9. Canadian government. Canada/Ontario invested $9.5 billion for 11.7% of new GM. They recovered most of it and kept the Oshawa, Ontario plant open, saving Canadian jobs. 10. Chinese market. GM's focus on China during and after bankruptcy was prescient. GM now sells more vehicles in China than the U.S. Buick is a status symbol in China. This market kept GM profitable during the tough recovery years. Was the bailout right? Arguments for. Saved millions of jobs. Prevented economic depression in Midwest. Protected pensions for hundreds of thousands. Kept U.S. automotive manufacturing alive. Only cost $10.5 billion, relatively cheap for the impact. GM is now profitable and investing in future technology. Arguments against. Rewarded failure and bad management. Created moral hazard. If you're big enough, government will save you. Violated free market principles. Hurt bondholders who followed the rules. Set precedent for government picking winners/losers. Some argue GM should have been allowed to fail and new companies emerge. The truth. Probably somewhere in between. The bailout prevented catastrophic short-term pain but may have created long-term distortions. What killed GM the first time? 1. Complacency. For decades, GM believed Americans would always buy American cars out of patriotism. They were wrong. Lesson. Customer loyalty must be earned, not assumed. 2. Bureaucracy. GM became so large and bureaucratic that simple decisions took months. They couldn't innovate fast enough. Lesson. Size can become a liability. Stay nimble. 3. Short-term thinking. Executives focused on quarterly profits, not long-term health. They pushed problems onto future management. Lesson. Kicking the can down the road eventually means hitting a wall. 4. Unsustainable promises. Promising unlimited pensions and health care when you can't predict 50 years of future costs is financial suicide. Lesson. Don't make promises you might not be able to keep. 5. Ignoring disruption. GM ignored fuel efficiency, quality improvements, and changing consumer preferences until it was too late. Lesson. Adapt or die. Disruption doesn't wait. 6. Brand bloat. 8 brands with overlapping products confused consumers and wasted resources. Lesson. Focus. Do fewer things better. 7. Addiction to high margins. GM became addicted to SUV/truck profits and abandoned small car markets to foreign competition. Lesson. Diversification matters. Don't put all eggs in one basket. The good. Americans can come together in crisis. Government intervention can work when done carefully. Second chances are possible. Innovation and reinvention are valued. The bad. We reward short-term thinking over long-term planning. We let problems fester until they become catastrophic. Political considerations often outweigh economic logic. We're deeply divided on the role of government. The ugly. Workers and middle-class investors often bear the cost of executive failures. Too big to fail creates unfair advantages. Regional economic devastation can result from corporate decisions. Recovery is painful and takes years. The current state. Is GM fixed? What's better? Profitable and stable. Better quality products. Finally competitive with Toyota/Honda. Focused brand portfolio. Investing heavily in electric future. Strong in China. No crushing debt. What's still concerning? Market share still declining. EV strategy not yet profitable. Still behind Tesla in EV technology and production. Dependent on trucks/SUVs for profits, haven't learned. Cruise autonomous vehicle setbacks. Question marks about whether they can truly compete in EV era. The ultimate question. Could it happen again? Probably not in the same way, but GM is in much better shape than 2008. Healthy balance sheet. No crushing legacy costs. Profitable. Conservative debt levels. But new threats exist. EV transition is expensive, billions in investment, years until profitable. Chinese EV makers are becoming formidable global competitors. If they fall behind in EV race, they could become obsolete. Autonomous vehicle technology enormously expensive with unclear payoff. The pattern to watch. Companies rarely die from sudden shocks. They die from slow decline in competitiveness, denial about changing markets, clinging to past strategies too long, death by 1,000 cuts. Sound familiar? The GM story is quintessentially American, both the rise and the fall. The rise embodied American optimism, innovation, and industrial might. A man with a dream built an empire that employed hundreds of thousands and powered the American economy. The fall exposed American short-sightedness, corporate greed, and denial. Decades of bad decisions, complacency, and kicking problems down the road led to collapse. The resurrection showed American pragmatism and resilience. When facing economic Armageddon, we did what was necessary, even if controversial. Today's GM is leaner, more focused, and more competitive. But it's also smaller, employs far fewer people, and faces an uncertain future in a rapidly changing industry. Is GM's story over? No. We're in the middle of Act 3, the EV transformation. Will GM successfully transition to an all-electric future? Will they compete with Tesla, BYD, and other EV makers? Will they remain relevant? Or will they repeat the mistakes of the past, moving too slowly, clinging to old business models, ignoring disruption? The next 10 years will tell us whether GM truly learned from its bankruptcy, or whether history will repeat itself.